my experiences of conflict have been generally to avoid it. And if there's something that's been bothering me, whether that's someone I work with, a friend, I would generally over the years have just thought, just avoid that, and I'll just simmer quietly, or let's just go and be bothered about it elsewhere. And there's a whole world of reasons to unpack about why that is. But I think maybe as a woman, is generally not encouraged. I know that probably times when I was maybe more assertive, it's been described as being bossy, maybe bitchy, all of those kind of things that generally we use for women. So yeah, I was wondering what you thought about this, that particular idea about healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict, and whether you think that's a useful way to think about it.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that I would draw attention to is, I think you point to the very gendered way in which we're taught to deal with conflict. That women are often taught to avoid conflict, or to deal with it, let's say, in more of a subterranean kind of way. Where for men, it's often taught that it's more virtuous to win conflict. Like if you disagree, go for it, but be convincing and put it to bed. But the idea is, across all of those, that conflict is something that's just somehow bad. It's a drag, and we should resolve it. Conflict should be resolved. We should make it go away. We should take care of it. And indeed, we can do that in more or less healthy ways. And depending on who you are, the healthy way looks different, depending on how much privilege you have. But I guess what I would maybe challenge in that way of thinking is that I think that way tends to idealize collaboration, and that there's a sense of conflict is bad, collaboration is good. They're opposites. We should strive for one rather than the other. And I would maybe look at that a little bit more paradoxically, and think that collaboration and antagonism or conflict always exist simultaneously at the same time, and always kind of disappearing into each other. And I think that makes sense if we consider life as a social process in which we're constantly encountering people who are different to ourselves. We're constantly encountering others, thank heavens, otherwise life would be pretty boring. And that means that we're constantly involved in relationships in a kind of political negotiation where we're trying to make alliances, and we're trying to work out how are we the same as other people, and how are we simultaneously different to them. And that's an inherently conflictual kind of process. So I think trying to make conflict go away doesn't make sense. I think all that we can do is kind of truncate it, obscure it, avoid it. And I think there's an invitation there to rather pay attention to it, and see how we could make that more useful part of the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, and I also think for me, I've always thought of conflict as the big things, right? Like the big shouting arguments, or the harsh words, or something really obvious that someone could say. They're in conflict. And I mean, we also use it in relation to wars, don't we? So I think that, like, what you're also speaking about is like, it's kind of, it's kind of happening all the time as we could sort of navigate being together as people. So yeah, I can't really avoid it. I'm not avoiding it.
But I think, like you're saying, conflict is a very charged sort of term. And I think that's interesting. And I think also, we need to think about the kind of political, and by that I don't mean kind of national politics, but I mean in terms of like power. How is conflict a part of the patterns of power relating that exist in groups of people, even in relationships between individuals. I think that conflict has a lot to do with working out who gets to have stuff and who doesn't get to have stuff. Where you talk about national kind of armed conflict, and I think that's also has a lot to do with the dynamics of privilege and power in groups, where some people are allowed to disagree and other people are not allowed to disagree. So while we find that aggression in a white, a middle class white man might be seen as virtuous, he might be seen as assertive, whereas in a black man may be seen as dangerous, threatening aggression, but relatively the same kind of behavior, whose interests are served, through the ways that we understand conflict in that sense.
I'm interested in, we've worked together using nonviolent communication, and I've really liked that in terms of thinking about the needs and the strategies and kind of separating that out.
Mm.
Sorry, you can hear the kid. Can you hear the kids next door?
Yeah.
There is conflict. And yeah, I guess we've talked a bit about the kind of universality of that, and I was just wondering, could you just add some, how has that helped you with thinking about it?
Right. Well, I guess, like I was saying, I think when we encounter other people, we encounter that we're the same as them, and also that we're different to them at the same time. And there's something quite difficult to hold in all of that. And I think Marshall Rosenberg gives us some useful insight. So this idea of the universality of needs points to an idea that, at a base level, there are things that connect us. There are things that matter to all of us that can serve as a basis for connection, even when we find ourselves seeing the world in very different ways, and we find ourselves in very antagonistic relationships to each other. We can still look for those points of connection that exist in universal needs. But that's not to say that the strategies, the differences between strategies are arbitrary, because they aren't. They also matter. The strategies that we use matter. People have things at stake here. And, I think Marshall Rosenberg also, spoke a great deal about domination systems, was the language that he tended to use. But I think he was constantly drawing attention to these kinds of dynamics of power and privilege that give some people's strategies more weight than others. So, I think there's an invitation here not to kind of cover over the difference, to look for the points of connection in our shared needs, and to look at how we can pay real attention to how we see things differently, and to trying to make sense of that and to understand the richness and diversity that brings. We kind of can have a fantasy about reaching this state where we just live in, where we've done away with conflict. And I think that's missing the point. I think that nonviolent communication gives us a slightly more pragmatic way to pay attention to conflict and to engage with it, and to acknowledge that it's perennial. There's no sense of like, okay, we've dealt with it now. We now live in blissful collaboration for all time. It's always going on, even in the moment of finding each other. We encounter some kind of difference, and this is the kind of dance and the play that I think that Marshall was drawing attention to. This is what being with other people is about. It's about conflict. It's about difference. It's about diversity. It's about the ongoing process of making sense of that together with other people, which can be violent, can be painful, can be destructive, or can be a source of joy and a source of engagement.
Yeah, and that's, for me, that's what I love about improvisation, and also that I've learned from NVC, is that like seeing these things as an offer and as a possibility.
Yeah, right on.